Thank you, Diane. I appreciate that. If any of you all have not received a bulletin, let Todd know. He will hook you up, because on the back part of that is a space for you to take some notes. But as we dive back into our series on transitions, years ago I was on a camping/riding trip with my dad and a few friends, and we're in the middle of a large forest in Florida, kind of in the summer where it's hot and sticky, and so we had been riding for a few hours and finally came upon a campsite where we can kind of stop for a little bit and get some rest. And as we were there, again, this is Florida where storms kind of roll in and roll out pretty quickly. As we were there, a storm kind of began rolling in from the distance, right? It kind of provided some nice shade and a nice gentle breeze, and man, this was a very welcome relief from the several hours of riding we had done through some crazy sugar sand. And as we were sitting out there, it's kind of more of an open field, and we're kind of talking and drinking our water and Gatorade just to kind of refresh ourselves. We noticed this funny little thing that began happening with our hair. Our hair began standing straight up. And for the first few minutes, we thought it was hilarious. We're like, man, your hair is wild. What did you do? And again, after a minute or two, you guys already know where this is going. Right after a minute or two, all of a sudden, we just go quiet, and we realize we're in trouble. And so we quickly duck into, and this is kind of a generous term to give it, the bathrooms of the campground, right? Pretty much just a cinder block wall with a hole in the wall. But we quickly ducked into there because we realized that we were effectively in a prime spot to get struck by lightning, right? Never had it happen since, but man, that was a wild experience. You see, we were taking a break from riding, from having a good time that afternoon, enjoying the cool breeze, enjoying the relaxing moment. But at that moment, when we realized all that static electricity gathering in that area, we knew it was time to move. In fact, moving was literally, and I'm not exaggerating this, literally a matter of survival. And I bring that up because as we talk about transitions and seasons of life that we can get in, we can get very comfortable. We can get very satisfied with the place that we find ourselves in. Even if it's uncomfortable, we at least like sitting in it. In fact, we can get in a season of life and not want to move. Right? Or maybe you get so comfortable you don't want to move, but maybe instead you get so deep in a season of life that you don't realize you can move. You don't realize that it's time for you to step out of the season that you're in. Maybe today as you walk into church and there's something on your heart, something that you have really been struggling with, something that has really made you wrestle, made you lose sleep at night. Maybe as you consider moving away from the season that you're in, maybe some fear is evoked. Maybe you're scared. Maybe you're scared about what's on the other side of this season of life that you're in. Maybe if you're like a lot of folks, you're so focused on getting by day by day by day, you fail to realize that there's actually an end that's possible. Or maybe you're just so settled in the transition that you don't want to change. And again, I want to affirm with you this today and let you know transitions are hard. Seasons of life, especially challenging seasons of life, can be difficult. But so is completing them. Right? We might be in a season today, but stepping out of that season, honestly, is just as challenging. And so we're in week 6 of our series on transitions. And again, we've been talking about transitions over the course of the summer because every single one of us in some capacity or another is going through a particular season of life, going through a transition, moving from one place to the next. And during all of these seasons of transition, God will use these very sometimes challenging periods of our life to accomplish some very important things. And so kind of the underlying theme of this series is, what is God doing in this season of your life? So we've been looking at different characters in Scripture. We've been walking through the Old Testament, and last week we talked about David, but today we're going to talk about our first female hero, right? Our first female character. We're going to look at the book of Esther. and talk about her story, how God brought her from one place to another place to accomplish some pretty awesome things. And so today, as we look at Esther's story, we're kind of just running with this underlying question. What does her story teach us about our transitions? And so turn to the book of Esther. And I want to encourage you to, there's 10 chapters in Esther. It reads pretty quickly. There's no way in the small amount of time we gather today to hit all of the highlights of her story and all of the details, but I'm going to do the best I can to kind of walk through her story. But again, I say that because if we talk about her today and you feel like things are missing or you want more information, go back and read the book of Esther. But transitions are incredibly hard, and so I want to begin diving into her story, and I want to observe some things that the author has made known to us or wants us to understand. And I'm going to go ahead and give you a heads up. There's a lot of names in here, and as many of you all know, I am not the best at pronouncing names. There is not a class in seminary that teaches you how to pronounce all the names of the Bible. So look critically, criticize me in your mind as we read these names, but we're going to have some fun. So look at Esther chapter 1, verse 1 through 5, as we kind of set the scene, the backdrop of Esther's story. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of the provinces were there before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So here we see kind of the backdrop of Esther's story, right? We dive into the Persian Empire, right? King Ahasuerus, also known as King Xerxes by the Greeks, he has this great party with all of the leaders throughout his empire, right? This party lasts for almost 6 months, and it ends with a week-long feast. Some experts believe that this was before he was going to go and try to conquer Greece itself. And if you watch the movie 300, you know that didn't go well. This is the same king. But let's keep going. Esther chapter 1, verse 10 through 12, kind of nearing the end of this feast. On the 7th day, and this is important to note, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, right? So we're going to make some good decisions here as a king. He commanded, now let's walk through these names, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So near the end of this giant party, that's kind of putting some terminology in there, end of this giant party, at the end of this feast, it tells us King Xerxes had quite a bit of wine. And so he invites his queen to come out and showcase her beauty. And again, there's a lot of theologians that argue what he was actually asking her to do. There's no real consensus. In fact, there's no real consensus on why she refuses to do so. But that's kind of beyond the point. The point is, this action angers the king. It upsets him. And in fact, if you read through the letter, it's kind of fun because all of his advisors say, you need to do something, king. She didn't listen to you. All the other wives in the empire are going to not listen to their husbands. I love how that was like the biggest problem of the day. But anyways, King Xerxes is upset. And so he has Queen Vashti removed from her position. And then, maybe he becomes sober or kind of gets a little bit of space between this choice, and he begins to desire a queen once again. And they realize that this law that was put into place, Queen Vashti can no longer be queen. And so he starts a new search for a new queen. And herein enters Esther. Take a look at Esther chapter 2, verse 5 through 8. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimea, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai looked after her as his own daughter. Verse 8. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. So Esther is brought into this kind of almost the Persian Empire's version of The Bachelor, right? They have the great king, and now we have all of these women that are potential mates for him, potential brides, and Esther is kind of shoved into this mix. And there's a lot of things that happen between here and where we're about to jump. Go back and read it, but what we see is Esther finds favor with the king. In fact, she becomes the queen. Look at Esther chapter 2, verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, some couple things that you need to understand, different bits of information that the author inserts into this narrative, I want us to go back and reflect upon because it's going to be helpful for our understanding of Esther's story. So go back and look at chapter 2 and verse 10, when Mordecai encourages Esther to go and become a potential mate, a potential wife for the king. He tells her this: Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So going on behind the scenes is Esther's Jewishness. Mordecai tells her, do not let anyone know that you are an ethnic Jew. And what you also need to understand is during this time, the Jews were already allowed to go back to Israel, to their homeland. But the very presence of this story lets us know that there are many Jews who decided to stay in the Persian Empire, probably because they were comfortable. They had gone through a painful season of transition, and now they've settled, and now they're there, and they're present, and they have no intention of returning back to Israel. But one thing you need to understand, again, I want to encourage you to go back and read this. We don't have time to cover all these things. For Esther to become the queen of Israel, the queen of Persia, the Persian Empire, there were a lot of God's laws that she had to violate to make this happen. Right? Go back and read her story of kind of how she became the queen, and they'll kind of stick out to you pretty quickly. But again, the tension point that the author brings up in this story is Esther's Jewishness, and really her compromising of her Jewishness to rise to this role. Hold on to that thought because we're going to continue to pick up her story in a moment, but the author now shifts from focus on Esther to Mordecai. And again, this is an important detail for us moving forward. Look at Esther chapter 2, verse 21 to 23. It tells us this: in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. And he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. After Esther becomes queen, the author inserts this note about Mordecai finding out about an assassination plot against King Xerxes. And it tells us that he informs Esther, and the assassination plot is put to an end. So hold on to that thought for a moment as we step back and reflect what the author has already shown us. Because in the first 2 chapters of this book, a lot has unfolded. Esther has gone from a nobody to a queen, right? Just the very jump in role and position lets us know that God is up to something here in her story. And as we reflect on her story, one thing that we need to be sensitive of as well when we are in transition is to understand that transitions are used to prepare us for what comes next. Right? As we read through Esther's story, you'll see that this transition was preparation for the role that God would have her fill later on as queen. But for now, as you walk through a transition, a painful situation, a hard season, understand that God will use that to prepare you for what comes next. And sometimes, just like in Esther's case, our transitions will drastically move us from one position or place in life to another. I mean, I think of job layoffs, right? People that are comfortable in a role that they might be in, they assume they're going to be there until they retire, and seemingly out of the blue, their company shuts down or moves, and now they have to transition from one job to another, sometimes from one place to another, from one career field to another. Sometimes our transitions will drastically move us from one place to the next. Sometimes there's key people in our life that we assume they're going to be around for the next 40, 50, 60 years, and we're always going to have this relationship, but some tragedy comes up, and all of a sudden they're gone. And God will use those painful transitions to prepare us for what comes next. He'll do that on the negative end, but even on the positive end, where God will drastically change even our place or position or role in life, and new key relationships will come in that will prepare us again, for what is next. See, some of our transitions occur to put us in the right place, particularly at the right time. See, the day before I had to go back to college, my junior year, I went out on a boat to do some tubing with some friends from church. In fact, Paige was there as well. And as you guys know, the joys of tubing, right? You get on the back of the boat and you're trying to turn and get that thing whipping to get some speed. And we would always have 2 different tubes set up so you're smashing into each other and it's good, clean, violent fun. And one of the things that we would do as guys is we would try to kick each other off, right? The last person on the tube is the winner, right? You claim that throne. And in one of these turns that we were taking, there's 2 tubes coming together. I was on the outside. There was a guy on the inside. And as we come together, I hit a wave, and I kind of turn in a little bit, and he comes in with his leg, and he kicks me in the face, right? Entirely accidental, kind of, I think. But the point is my mouth started to bleed instantly. And instantly, I knew something was wrong, right? My front teeth are starting to wiggle. And I'm like, this is not good. Right, first off, I had to find a dentist, right? It's like Sunday afternoon. I'm going back to school the next day. And then I'm worried about the fact that what's going to happen to my teeth. Now, here's one of the crazy things about that story. In the boat with us, I was with a group of people who were uniquely equipped to solve that problem. You see, 2 out of the 6 people in that boat were dentists. And so what we did, they took a look at my mouth, and one of them, as we went to his office, we're still dripping wet, and he sat there in his swimsuit, and he fixed my mouth for me. You see, I had a problem that came up, and I was with a group of people who were uniquely equipped to help me with that problem. And as we look at Esther's story, the author wants us to be in awe of God's sovereignty, right? You see God moving behind the scenes. It doesn't explicitly say it. This is one of the cool things about the book of Esther. But going on behind the scenes is God's sovereignty as he positions Esther into a place where she can address a problem that comes up. And so something else I want you to take note of as well as you're walking through a transition. Yes, your transitions are used to prepare you for what comes next. But our transitions also uniquely equip us for what comes next. Right? It puts us in the place to help, but it also equips us to help. It gives us the skills, the resources, the influence. Now, remember, at the end of chapter 2, there's this small little bit about Mordecai spoiling an assassination attempt for King Xerxes. And the very next chapter, in chapter 3, you, as the reader, would expect that Mordecai would be rewarded. Except what happens? He's not. Look at chapter 3, verse 1 through 2. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, we're going to go on that one, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Right? And you as the reader would breathe a painful sigh saying, wait, hold on a second. Mordecai should be in this role, not Haman. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. So, Mordecai doesn't get the role, but Haman does. And what we see here at the end of verse 2 is Mordecai refuses to bow down to honor Haman for the role that he was in. And it's important to note here that there wasn't anything against Jewish faith to recognize someone's position of authority. And I spent a lot of time kind of wrestling with Mordecai and his behavior and actions at this point, and the best that I can come up with is that he's a little bitter. He's a little angry and upset. He probably didn't like Haman from the start, but he is in a role that Mordecai should have had. At least he feels like he should have had, and so he refuses to bow down to Haman. And this gives Haman the excuse he needs to act on his anti-Semitism. In fact, he launches a plot against all the Jews. Take a look at chapter 3, verse 3 through 6. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gates said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the Lord's command?" Or the king's command, right? "Why are you not bowing down, honoring the role that Haman is in?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. Kind of an important note. This is the same man that told Esther to hide her faith. This man is now using it as an excuse for his behavior. But let's go on. Verse 5. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. And so, again, Mordecai does not bow down to Haman. Haman's upset and angry about this, and this gives Haman the excuse to act on his anti-Semitic inclinations. Look back at verse 4. I want to point out to you again. All of our characters here are filled with flaws. Esther found her place in the kingdom because she compromised her faith. Mordecai uses his faith as an excuse to not bow down to Haman. At the end of verse 4, it tells us in chapter 3, end of verse 4, that he told them he didn't do this because he was a Jew. He uses his faith when it's convenient. And again, I believe he was bitter. Haman is in the role that Mordecai believes he should have had. And Mordecai's refusal gives Haman the excuse to act on his anti-Semitic inclinations. And so, maybe you're familiar with the story. Haman goes to the king, and he deceives the king to sign a law to have all of the Jews eradicated throughout the entire empire, right? It's not just in the local vicinity, but it's throughout the entire Persian empire. Again, the Jews are not unfamiliar with genocide attempts. Chapter 3, verse 8 through 9. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom." Again, a gentle dig at the Jews who have not returned back to their homeland. "Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." Right? He's beginning to insinuate that the Jewish people are going to create problems in the empire. "If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasury." So the king, verse 10, took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good. And here is the tension, the drama of our story. The Jews are going to be exterminated. The destruction of the Jews is now law. And something to note about Persian law, I actually just recently learned this. Persian law was immutable, meaning that once it was put into place, it could not be changed. The only way for it to be countered was to create a law that countered the other law. This always had blown my mind when you read about Daniel in the lion's den and how the king is upset that Daniel is going to be tossed into the lion's den. I always wondered, why did the king just change the law? He's the king. Well, this is why. Persian law is immutable. And so Persian law, to have the Jews exterminated, would seem that this was a sure thing. And the drama of the text up to this point has set us up to look now to Esther to help with this problem. She is in the right place, and now she has this tension point. What will she do as the queen of the Persian Empire? For us, as we navigate transitions, what problem do you have in your sphere of influence that you are uniquely equipped to solve? Maybe right now you know of someone going through a hard time, maybe a job loss, maybe a rough season with their kids or a spouse, maybe the loss of a loved one, and they're going through a challenging time, and this is something that you have gone through as well that you are uniquely equipped to help them walk through. You see, the reality is the transitions we have been through in the past uniquely equip us to deal with the challenges around us today. See, God will often use transitions and painful seasons of life to give us the tools, to give us the skills, and even the experience to be used by Him in the future. Right? The transitions we have been through in the past uniquely equip us to deal with the challenges around us today. Now let's continue our story. Esther now has a choice to make. And Mordecai hears about this law that goes into place, and he approaches Esther for help. Take a look at chapter 4, the first verse. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and a bitter cry. He's upset, right? This is a law that's been put into place. He and all his friends and family are going to be killed. So verse 8 to 11 now. Mordecai is communicating to Esther through her assistant. And it tells us this: Mordecai also gave him, this is the assistant to Esther, gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and to plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, right here she's evoking the immutable law of the Persian Empire, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. Man, imagine that policy for you at work. If someone comes into your office or your space without being summoned, you're done. Esther has a choice to make. Mordecai approaches her with the problem and says, will you go before the king and beg that he do something about this law, this decree? Will the king spare her for approaching him without first being summoned, right? This is the tension of the story. And something I want you to understand, because the author brings this up, is that when risk is not present, faith and courage are not needed, right? When risk is not present, faith and courage are not needed. For Esther, there is immense risk to going before the king and pleading the case for the Jewish people. So this act was going to take immense courage and immense faith. And that's why as you sit in the midst of transition, wondering when and how you will walk out of this phase of life, it does take immense faith and immense courage, because there is significant risk with walking into the unknown. Esther pushes back on Mordecai. Last few verses, and we'll kind of summarize the rest of her story for the sake of time. Esther pushes back, obviously, reminds Mordecai of the king's laws. And she is challenged by Mordecai, probably some of the most famous verses from her story. Esther chapter 4, look at verses 12 to 14. After she pushes back. And they told Mordecai what Esther said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Esther has an incredibly risky move to make. She must express unwavering courage and faith. Did God put her in that role for that time to serve as a point of intercession for her people? Now, we don't have time to read through the rest of the story, but Esther does go before the king, and she does gain his favor. And to summarize the last few chapters, right, the Jewish people are saved. A law is put into place that counteracts the law that was put into place to kill all the Jews. This law allows the Jews to defend themselves. And Haman is identified for his evil plot, and he is put to death, and Mordecai is promoted after the king realizes his part in saving his life so many seasons ago. All right, the story ends happily, right? There is a good end to this story. And as you read the book of Esther, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there is no mention of God throughout the entire book. There's no mention of God's laws, just the laws of the Israelites. There's no mention of sacrifices or offerings being made. In fact, these facts make a lot of critics of Scripture say this book should not even be in the Bible. But if you read through all 10 chapters of this book, it's hard to miss God's sovereignty on full display. God might be seemingly absent, but within the text, you see God working sovereignly behind the scenes. And he works within the brokenness of his people, the brokenness of Esther, the group of Jewish people who did not go back to Israel. He works within the brokenness of Mordecai and all of the characters of the story in order to preserve his people, to keep his promises. So what does Esther's story teach us about transition? Sometimes we need to move. Sometimes we've been in the state of transition way too long, and we need to take courage and make that step of faith. We need to move. And so what I want to do as we end this conversation is wrestle with this final question. How do you know when it's time to move? Take a look at Esther chapter 4 in verse 13. When Mordecai pushes back against Esther, he lets it be known to her. Verse 14. For if you keep silent, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all of the other Jews. What Mordecai is saying is, Esther, you are a Jewish individual as well. You are just as susceptible to this law as all of us. You cannot hide. One way or another, Esther, your life is about to change. So you got a choice to make. And for us, maybe right now as you sit through a challenging season of life, God has put something on your heart time and time and time again. And figuratively, or maybe literally, you cannot hide from this burden. Ignoring God's leading in your life won't make it go away. And you will grow increasingly agitated and full of regret until you act on that burden God has put in your heart. So maybe for you today, as you decide, do I need to move? Do I need to step out in faith? Maybe there's something God has put in your heart that you can simply not hide or run from. But that's not the only item to consider when you need to think about, do I need to move from this season of life or not? You also need to consider, do you have an opportunity? Look at Esther chapter 4 and verse 14. Mordecai tells her, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. I love how Mordecai lets it be known, hey, Esther, you have a prime opportunity to be used by God to preserve his people here. And Esther, have a bigger view of God's sovereignty. Because if it's not you, God's going to preserve his people in some other capacity. So Esther, you have a prime opportunity. As you are considering, hey, is it time to move? God will lay something on your heart. He will challenge you, but he'll also present you with the opportunity. So maybe you've been challenged, but now God has presented you with the opportunity. And this isn't just a random opportunity, but rather a specific opportunity in line with a prayerful communication to God. 2 things to consider, but 3 things really need to work in tandem. You have to have the ability as well. Look at Esther chapter 4 and verse 14. Mordecai tells her, "Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai could not have filled that role. He qualified for the first 2, right? This was a need that was very apparent to him. It was on his heart. He had the opportunity. He was in the space to get to the king, but he didn't have any saying or voice with the king. He had no ability. Only Esther did. He says, Esther, God likely puts you in this position to save his people. And I want you to notice the difference between opportunity and ability. Sometimes God will put things on your heart, and you'll see opportunities to engage on those burdens, but God will also equip you and give you the ability to fulfill that need. Who knows if you're going through this season of life right now for that next step? All 3 of those things have got to work together. So where do you need to step out in faith today? Esther was willing to forgo the risk, or to ignore the risk, I should say, because she realized it was time to move. And so today I want to encourage you as you are in a season of transition. Some of you are in this season, and there is no exit at this point. But for some of you, you continue to sit there, and there has been opportunities. God has put things on your heart, and you have the ability to transition from one place to another, yet you fail to do it. And I want to encourage you to step in and go forth. See, back when we were camping, we had to, or camping/riding, right? We had to run into that nasty camp bathroom to avoid getting struck by lightning. And at that time, we were happy to be there. And maybe today you need to move as well. 2 questions I want you to wrestle with this week. How long have you been in your current season of transition? And how would you know it is time to move? Let's bow our heads in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for this story that you preserved for us. Thank you for Esther's courage and willingness to step out in faith and be used by you. And God, just like Esther and Mordecai, we are imperfect human beings. Man, we fail to follow your laws. We fail to represent you well. But God, even in the midst of our brokenness, you are still willing to use us. And so God, I pray for everyone here today who is walking through a challenging season of life, and you have put it on their heart. It's time to step out of that. It's time to act on that opportunity. It's time to utilize those abilities that you've given them. I pray you give them the courage and the faith to do so. And I pray that you give them that extra bit of blessing and encouragement of being used by you and seeing your sovereignty on full display. Lord, we love you. Give us the strength and the courage that we need to act accordingly. In your name, amen.